June 23, 2002, the boardroom at HealthSouth's Birmingham headquarters erupted in a roar as Richard Scrubby, the charismatic CEO, declared that the company had finally cracked the code to beat the market every quarter. The room exploded with applause, but hidden behind the celebratory clamor was a dark promise: to deliver growth at any cost, even if it meant forging numbers on the very ledger that investors trusted. Founded in 1984 by a former Army medic, HealthSouth began as a modest chain of outpatient surgery centers, promising affordable, high-quality care to a nation still nursing the aftershocks of the 1980s recession. By the early 1990s, Scrubby's aggressive acquisition strategy turned the fledgling firm into a behemoth. He bought up struggling hospitals across the South, rebranded them under the HealthSouth banner, and leveraged a booming demand for lean healthcare delivery. Within a decade, the company's footprint spanned more than 80 states, its revenue eclipsing $10 billion, and its stock price surged from a modest $4 per share to over $100. The rise seemed unstoppable. Analysts lauded HealthSouth as the poster child of corporate America's new wave of managed care, efficiency, and Scrubby was hailed as a visionary who could turn any loss-making hospital into a profit machine. The company's glossy annual reports showcased immaculate balance sheets, a growing dividend, and a culture that celebrated quarter-over-quarter growth like a sport. Employees were encouraged to think like entrepreneurs. "You are the owners of this company," became a mantra shouted in every hallway. The story, however, hid a crucial omission: the relentless pressure to post numbers that never quite matched the reality on the ground. By the mid-1990s, warning signs began to flicker beneath the surface. Internal auditors noted discrepancies in the accounting of acquisition costs, while regional managers complained of impossible revenue targets that required creative accounting to meet. Whispers of adjusting expense lines grew louder, but Scrubby's iron grip turned dissent into silence. He instituted a quarterly performance review where every division chief was presented with a simple, chilling directive: if you can't meet the forecast, make it happen. The unspoken implication was clear: falsify the books or face termination. The culture of compliance morphed into a culture of collusion. Employees were taught to bump revenue figures to record phantom patients and to inflate service charges on paper. In return, they received generous bonuses, stock options, and the promise of job security in a company that seemed invincible. The corporate mantra shifted from patient care to quarterly targets, and the line between ethical stewardship and criminal fraud blurred until it vanished entirely. Outside the walls of HealthSouth, the market cheered. Share prices climbed and institutional investors piled in, lured by the promise of double-digit growth. The company's public relations machine painted a picture of a healthcare hero, rescuing failing hospitals and delivering cutting-edge services to underserved communities. Meanwhile, the internal reality was a house of cards built on fabricated earnings, with each quarter demanding larger and more elaborate adjustments to keep the illusion intact. The first concrete warning sign came in late 1999, when a whistleblower, a mid-level accountant named Michael Brown, noticed that the company's reported cash flow from operations vastly exceeded its actual cash receipts. He raised the issue with the audit committee, only to be met with a curt dismissal and a reminder that the numbers are what matter. Brown's concerns were quietly filed away, and the company pressed on, its facade unblemished to the outside world. In early 2002, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission began probing several large healthcare firms for accounting irregularities. HealthSouth's name surfaced in a confidential tip that suggested the company's earnings had been significantly overstated. The probe intensified when a former employee, fearing retaliation, provided the SEC with internal memos that explicitly referenced Scrubby's quarterly edicts to make the numbers work. The agency's investigators uncovered a trove of forged documents, fabricated patient records, and false invoices that together painted a picture of systematic fraud on a monumental scale. The collapse unfolded with a ferocity that shocked Wall Street. In March 2003, HealthSouth announced a restatement of earnings for the previous 5 years, revealing that it had inflated its revenue by a staggering $2.7 billion, roughly 30% of its reported earnings. The company's stock plummeted from a high of $115 per share to under $10 in a matter of weeks, erasing billions in market value. Scrubby, once the darling of investors, was forced to resign, and shortly thereafter faced indictment on multiple counts of securities fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The fallout rippled far beyond the boardroom. Thousands of employees lost their jobs as the company shed clinics and closed facilities in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Patients in rural communities, who had come to rely on HealthSouth's network for essential services, found themselves without nearby hospitals, forcing them to travel long distances for care. Pension funds that had heavily invested in HealthSouth stock saw their balances evaporate, leaving retirees facing uncertain futures. Legal repercussions followed swiftly. In 2004, Scrubby was convicted on 36 counts of fraud, sentencing him to 20 years in federal prison, a term later reduced on appeal but never fully erased from his record. The U.S. Department of Justice secured a civil settlement of $2.8 billion from HealthSouth, the largest corporate fraud penalty of its time. The company itself entered a rigorous corporate rehabilitation program, appointing a new leadership team tasked with restoring transparency and rebuilding trust. Subscribe to The Collapse for more stories like this.